Election Yard here to review and put a wrap on the 2025 Canadian federal election. We're going to tie a little bow on this thing with the best sleeveless election commentary anywhere on the internet. You know, it's our vibe, it's our thing. It's just what we do. Anyway, Canada voted on Monday, April 28th. It took us actually a little bit of time to go live with this video. We're doing this on Tuesday night, and the reason is because it actually took us a little bit of time to figure out how the election had actually gone. As of Monday night, we had a good idea that we were heading for a liberal, maybe minority government, but it took until Tuesday afternoon to really seal that up. So here we are, liberal minority government. It's on the screen right behind me, so there you go. That's what's happened in Canada. The Liberals have won a fourth term. New leader, same result, a liberal minority government. This is actually 3 liberal minority government wins in a row. Justin Trudeau won a majority in 2015, but minorities in 2019, 2021, and now 2025. This one, of course, under Mark Carney, the Prime Minister who will stay in office. Now, a fourth liberal term, that's not really unprecedented. It's happened before in the Chrétien Martin days. Jean Chrétien won 3 straight majorities, 93, 97, and 2000. And then Paul Martin won a minority government in 2004. So that was 4 wins in a row. But it didn't get to 5, let's put it that way. So that might be in the back of some liberal minds. But they're not really thinking about that right now. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my background. I have been nerding out about Canadian elections for the last 25 years. My first Canadian election was back in 2000. Those were the days of Jean Chrétien, Stockwell Day, Joe Clark, Gilles Duceppe, Alexa McDonough, people like that. I will say that this is probably the strangest election, certainly the most unprecedented campaign that I've seen in my 25 years of following these things. In terms of the opinion polling, I would say the polls were kind of right. But different provinces kind of broke in different directions, and we're going to get into the provincial numbers in a little bit. Just to paint the picture, if you had told me prior to the election that the Liberals were going to win 25 seats in Atlantic Canada and that they were going to end up with 44 in Quebec, I would have told you that they'd be cruising to a majority. They'd probably win between 180 and 190 seats. They'd be in like Flint, as the kids say, and that would be it. But that's not what happened. Like I said, different provinces kind of did different things in this election, and we'll get into that. But to set the stage, it was really Ontario that did them in. The Liberals underperformed there worse than anywhere else, and we will look at the specific seat numbers in a little bit. But let's look at the big picture, the overall results. We're going to put them up on the screen now. Keep in mind that a few of these seats are going to go to recounts because of how close they were. There were seats decided by less than 100 votes. The bottom line is it will be a liberal minority government. The Liberals at 169 seats. The Conservatives at 144. The Bloc Québécois at 22. The NDP at 7. The Greens at 1. The Liberals are 3 seats short. They needed 172 for a majority government. They got 169. Nice. So now, 2 things can be true about this election. The Liberals can be disappointed about not winning a majority, given how good the polls had gotten in recent weeks. And they can be disappointed based on how they did in Ontario relative to the other provinces. But they can also be thrilled that they won the election at all. If you had told a Liberal staffer 6 months ago that not only would the Liberals win the 2025 election, but that they'd win more seats than they had in 2021, they'd do a backflip, a split, and then a death drop. They would have been thrilled. So now, before we get to the provincial splits, I'll say this too. I think this might be a rare election where I'm not really sure anyone's truly happy with how things went. Let's go down the list of the parties. The Liberals, for the reasons that I just cited above, they couldn't close the deal on a majority. They let themselves down in the most important province, and they still have a lot of work to do. But it was okay for them. It was certainly better than the alternative. The Conservatives were basically the Atlanta Falcons. They blew a 25-point lead in the second half, and they lost the election. And Pierre Poilievre lost his seat, a seat he'd had for over 20 years. This was the unlosable election for the Conservatives, and they lost. So they gained seats, but I can't imagine that they're too thrilled with the fact that they were even in this situation. Now, the Bloc Québécois, they lost seats, maybe not as many as they feared they could have lost, but they were at 33 after the last election. Now they're at 22. So it's not horrible. It's not as bad as what happened to the NDP, but they're not going to be popping any champagne bottles either. To make matters worse for them, the Liberal minority is strong enough that the Bloc really doesn't have the balance of power. Even if the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois get together to vote down the government, they still need the NDP, and we will get into whether or not I think that will happen anytime soon. Now, as for the NDP, I mean, look, I think you know, it was the worst election result in the party's history. You look back at 1993, that was their previous worst result, back when Audrey McLaughlin was leader. They won 9 seats in 1993, and the Commons was under 300 seats. Now it's 343, and they won 7. So this is a very, very small percentage of MPs that the NDP came away with, record low vote share. And then Jagmeet Singh, like Pierre Poilievre, also lost his seat. Now, when we did our preview video, I had noted that I thought Jagmeet Singh was going to lose. That wasn't really going out on a limb. I think a lot of people were expecting that Jagmeet Singh was going to lose his seat. But I was becoming convinced that he wouldn't even come in second, and he didn't. Not only did he not come in second, he was a distant third. So he is way out. And of course, he resigned the leadership. So the NDP had some bright spots here and there, holding on to some seats that I'm not sure people thought they would. A couple in Vancouver, one in Winnipeg. They held on to Nunavut, for example. But it was mostly just a putrid election result for them. They were going to need a new leader anyway, because there was no way that Singh was going to survive this. But now he is literally out the door, so they're just going to be starting from scratch, pretty much. And finally, the Green Party. I mean, Elizabeth May keeps winning. She keeps hanging on to that seat on Vancouver Island. But they had another MP, Mike Morris. He lost out in Ontario. And the Greens were sparsely competitive anywhere else. So they were just essentially a non-factor. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go province to province, or province to territory, territory to province, whatever. We're going to look at the seat breakdown for each. We're going to start with Newfoundland and Labrador, which is where election night started on Monday. The Liberals ended up winning 5 seats, the Conservatives with 2. So the Conservatives held on to central Newfoundland. They won Long Range Mountains. They damn near won Terra Nova, and they might still on a recount. So one thing that I have learned in a quarter century of watching Canadian elections, both at the federal and provincial level, is that Newfoundland, when they vote, they're just basically going to do whatever the hell they feel like. So even though there were other provinces in Atlantic Canada that were breaking hard to the Liberals, Newfoundland was kind of going the other way. And of course, there are local issues and local candidates that influence these things. But the Conservatives, all things considered, didn't do terrible. And I think Newfoundland was the first sign we had that the bottom really wasn't going to fall out. Now, if the Liberals had won all 7 seats on the island, they'd still be a seat short of a majority. But, you know, it could have been worse, but it also could have been better. Out to Prince Edward Island, not really much to discuss here. The Liberals swept all 4 seats again. Some of them were close, like Egmont, but at the end of the day, the Liberals were going to win all 4, and they did. Nova Scotia, this was actually... It ended up being a good night for the Liberals, but it took some time to get there. The Liberals won 10 seats. The Conservatives only won 1. And that ended up getting very close at the end. That was Acadianapolis with Chris d'Entremont. The Liberals, for a lot of election night, were in bad shape in South Shore St. Margaret's. They were in bad shape in Cumberland Colchester, and they were in bad shape in Central Nova. Central Nova was a seat that they expected to hold easily. And it ended up getting there at the very end. But for long stretches of election night, the Conservatives led in all of those seats. So this could have been a very different split in Nova Scotia. But then the late ballots came in and all of those seats broke to the Liberals. So it was damn near a clean sweep of Nova Scotia. So this was, also maybe a little bit of a tell that, maybe things in the Maritimes weren't as desperate for the Liberals as maybe they looked in Newfoundland. And then you go out to New Brunswick. I think it would be fair to say this is probably the most CPC-friendly province in Atlantic Canada. The Liberals won 6 seats. The Conservatives won 4. The Conservatives held on in Miramichi, Grand Lake. It was very close. But then they won the 3 other safe seats that they were supposed to win. The Liberals won the seats that they were supposed to win in. For a little while, the Conservatives were ahead in Madawaska, but I was never really concerned about that. Had the Liberals lost that seat, that would have been a big problem. But I never really saw that as happening. So you add it up, the Liberals got right to where they needed to be, about 25 seats in Atlantic Canada. So I would have thought that they were on a majority pace, but as it turned out, they were a little behind it. But not because of what happened in Quebec. If you look at Quebec, Quebec doesn't owe the Liberals anything at this point. They more than did their part to try to help them get to a majority. The Liberals won 44 seats in Quebec. We were thinking maybe if the Liberals could win 38 at minimum, that they'd be in all right shape, certainly if they got to 40, but they got to 44. The Bloc Québécois at 22, the Conservatives only 11. Now, we had established that the Conservative ceiling in Quebec is probably something like 13 or 14 seats at this point, so they didn't quite get there. The Liberals had a good night, and they ended up even winning a seat like Terrebonne, which we thought was maybe a little bit more of a reach for them, but they ended up grabbing it, granted by a very, very tiny margin, even though the Bloc did hold on in a few places like Shefford, for example. And the NDP did hold that one seat that they have on the island of Montreal. But then you get to Ontario. This is where things got really interesting. So look at these results here. The Liberals won 69 seats, the Conservatives 53, the NDP, big old goose egg, 0. Who knows when the last time that happened was? I'm sure I could look it up, but I don't have that right in front of me. Needless to say, it's been a long time since Ontario had 0 NDP and MPs. It's been a while. Here's the thing. The Liberals were hoping for probably something more like 80 in Ontario. They were hoping for something in the 80s. And if they had, they would have won a clear majority government, but they didn't. The 905... the GTA, it was fairly red. I mean, look, you can't look at the results to my side here and say that the Liberals didn't do okay in Ontario. I mean, they won 16 more seats than the Conservatives, almost 70. Like, that's fine, but it's nowhere near as good as they wanted it to be. The Conservatives swept Windsor. The Conservatives won a seat in Hamilton. The Conservatives were winning seats in Kitchener. The Conservatives actually broke into Toronto and won a seat there. And they were winning seats in the suburbs, doing a lot better than expected in places like Brampton. The Conservatives definitely did some work down in the 905, made some gains, perhaps gains that came due to vote splitting that broke in their favor, but some of these seats that they flipped really weren't even close. So you have to think, especially when you look at results like Windsor, and then, of course, London Fanshawe going for the Conservatives, breaking a 2-decade Matheson NDP dynasty there. Did all of these NDP votes go to the Liberals? I don't think so. In fact, I would say probably not. So I think the Liberals, what they need to take away from this is that if they want to start getting some of these votes back, they have to figure out if there was, in fact, a migration of some of these voters in Ontario going from the NDP to the Conservatives, why that is. What are some of the economic and social issues that these people are concerned about that ended up putting them from going from a left-leaning party to the Conservatives? Because the Conservatives, they've become more Americanized, let's say, under Poilievre, and they're taking more of a populist tack. And I think you can say, based on the election results, that clearly worked for some people. So I think the Liberals really need to look long and hard at what happened here and how they can maybe get those voters back. But it's hard to say that, Ontario was a disappointment as 69-53 split, but it actually kind of was, especially considering how some of these other provinces went. And when we get to British Columbia, you'll see again that some provinces, when it comes to the Liberals potentially winning their majority, some provinces did their part. And Ontario, not really. And now we move towards the west. Manitoba, the Conservatives won 7 seats. The Liberals won 6, that's a pretty decent result for them in Manitoba. The NDP did hold one of their seats there, but they did lose Elmwood Transcona. They also lost the NDP Churchill. Nikki Ashton, she lost that seat. This is certainly okay for the Liberals, and I will also now transition to Saskatchewan here, because you'll see 1 seat. You're going to say, how is that okay for the Liberals? Well, considering that the previous 2 elections that the Conservatives swept all 14, this is actually pretty good, because the Liberals don't really win seats in Saskatchewan. The last time before Monday that they had won a seat in Saskatchewan was Ralph Goodale back in 2015. So not only did the Liberals get on the board here, but they actually won that seat, Desnethy, Missinippi, Churchill River. They won it fairly easily. They were hoping maybe they could be competitive in a seat in Saskatoon, maybe Regina, Wascana, but it didn't end up panning out for them. But they'll take a seat out of Saskatchewan. Now, Alberta, this is definitely fortress conservative. It always has been, at least in modern times. That's just what it's been. The Conservatives, 34 seats, the Liberals, 2. The NDP, 1. I think we were looking at, based on the popular vote that was coming out of the polls, and the Liberals did get almost 30% of the popular vote in Alberta, which for them is great, but it only translated into 2 seats. I think we were looking at the non-conservative parties, whether it was the Liberals or the NDP, getting more like 5 seats if they were going to be tracking the way that the polls suggested, and they only ended up getting 3. So the Conservatives, I think, they already do great in Alberta, but I think they ended up pulling together a little bit more of an efficient vote in Alberta than I think maybe some like me suspected that they would. So this was just ever so slightly the tiniest disappointment, because, the Liberals for sure were hoping to break through in Edmonton, and they were hoping to break through in Calgary, and they won a seat in each, but that's really about it. So not really much to write home about here for them. But then you go further west into British Columbia, and the Liberals won 20 seats in BC, the Conservatives 19. The NDP somehow held on to 3 seats there. And Elizabeth May, she's back. Who knows? Maybe she'll be speaker. She ended up holding on to her seat. 20 seats for the Liberals in BC is unprecedented. In the preview video, we had noted that I think it was 15 seats in 2015. Maybe it was 17 seats. Something around that, 15 to 17 seats in the 2015 election. That was their prior modern high watermark, the Liberals in this province, and now they're at 20. If you look at a map of Metro Vancouver, a lot of it's red. So this is pretty unprecedented for the Liberals, this kind of success in the province. Of course, they were helped out quite a bit by the NDP vote just melting into nothing. Of course, Jagmeet Singh, distant third in his riding, not even close. But even in spite of that, the NDP somehow held 3. We were thinking maybe Vancouver East would be the only seat that the NDP would hold in the province, but then they ended up winning Kingsway, and they won another one out in Vancouver Island. But also, I guess in that respect, it wasn't the worst it could have possibly been for the NDP out there, but it wasn't good. And meanwhile, the Liberals really got just about all they possibly could have out of British Columbia. Maybe you would have liked to see them win a seat or 2 more, and if they had, they might have won a majority, but was not to be. I think the phrase tactical voting clearly isn't a thing in some sectors of Canadian politics and the minds of voters. There were some crazy vote splits. The Conservatives winning seats, places like Vancouver Island, where they hardly ever win, at least not in some of these seats that they were getting. So we'll just have to see what the fallout from that is. But the Liberals would absolutely gladly have taken 20 seats out of BC. They'd have been absolutely thrilled if you told them that's what they were going to get 6 months ago. And then finally, you look at the North, the Liberals with 2, and the NDP with 1. The Conservatives were never going to win any of the 3 territories. None of it was interesting because you had an incumbent NDP MP there running for re-election, and she just barely won. I think we all just kind of assumed with the way the national polls were going that, small voter pool doesn't take much of a shift. and that the Liberals would take it, but they didn't. But the Liberals held on in Yukon and the Northwest Territories. And, every seat in a minority government situation, especially one that's so close to the majority line, every seat matters. And I know that going into Tuesday afternoon, even as the votes were being counted, the Liberals were hoping that Nunavut would flip back to them right at the very end, as a couple other ridings did elsewhere in the country, but it didn't. So that ended up being somewhat costly. So those were the provincial level results. The bottom line, the Liberals have won again. That is a fourth straight mandate. Not completely unprecedented, but definitely uncommon. A different Conservative leader might have won this election. Poilievre was criticized for not getting on the Team Canada train forcefully enough when Donald Trump started the trade war stuff. Whereas other Conservatives like Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, he was front and center, waving the flag, doing his thing. And this hesitation, I guess I'll call it, really helped the Liberals, now behind Mark Carney, not Justin Trudeau anymore, to assume the mantle of the Party of National Unity. And that is part of the reason why they vacuumed away 2/3 of the NDP's support. However, as we just discussed in Ontario, clearly not all of the NDP's support went to the Liberals. And I think if any of us made that assumption, perhaps I did to some degree too, that clearly wasn't correct. Back to Poilievre, though, I would say that it's hard to make the case that he could have ultimately won this election with this current dynamic at the end of the day, when he couldn't even get reelected in his own seat that he held for over 20 years. The Liberals actually did quite well in Eastern Ontario. They swept the Ottawa ridings. But this one hurts for the Conservatives, for sure. Now, I am of the mind that I don't think it's impossible that Pierre Poilievre will try to get back into Parliament and try to hold on to his leadership, and that some safe seat Alberta Conservative MP is going to get sandbagged or get talked out of staying in office and will resign, and Poilievre will win a by-election out there and he'll be back. But that's going to take some time. So now this kind of segues into the next topic of how long do we think this new government with the Liberals at 169 seats, how long do we think it's going to last? Minority governments in Canada do not usually go the full 4-year term. This last one went 3.5-ish, but that's also because the NDP had a confidence and supply agreement with them for a good while, which helped prolong their government. I do think this government's going to go for a little while. If I had to guess, I would say it's going to go probably at least 2 years, and let me tell you why. The Liberals are only 3 seats shy of that majority marker. They needed 172, they're 169. That's not terrible. But then you look at the NDP. The NDP has 7 seats. You add those together, that's 176. Now, I don't mention that because I think that there's any chance that they're going to form a coalition. That's not really what we're talking about here. And then, Elizabeth May is 177. And again, I'm not really joking. They might ask her to be speaker. Who knows? Only time will tell. But the reason that this is important, those 7 seats for the NDP exceeding 172 and taking with the Liberals, is because if the NDP does not want the government to fall in a confidence motion, it is not going to fall. The Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, you add them together, they do not have 172 votes to bring down the government. So it's really on the NDP at this point. And when you look at the NDP, what they have just gone through, why would the NDP want to go back to the polls anytime soon, based on what they've just been through? They have just been decimated. They have no leader. They're going to go through a leadership race. They don't have very many MPs. I just can't see any scenario in which it would be intelligent for the NDP to want to force another election within the next 6 months to a year. It would seem relatively foolish when their top priority right now should be getting a leadership campaign underway, starting the rebuild process. And come to think of it, I'm not even really sure why the Conservatives would want to go right back to the polls either. Considering that their leader just lost his seat, there is a non-zero chance that the Long Knives are going to come out pretty soon. Because look, we just said it before. The Conservatives were kind of like the Atlanta Falcons. They had a 25-point lead and they didn't win the big game. So I guarantee you there are going to be some conservatives out there. Whether or not they say it publicly is one thing. But there are going to be some conservatives in Canada that are going to say to themselves privately, this guy just blew an unlosable election. Why do we got to do him any favors? Why does he get to keep his leadership? Why can't we try something else? So we'll see. I could go either way on this as to whether or not Poilievre will still be the leader of the Conservatives in a year. I don't think he'll go willingly, but obviously the fact that he lost his seat, certain things would have to be set in motion for him to get back into the House of Commons. And I don't rule out the possibility that someone somewhere will say, you know what, I'm going to challenge this guy. So we'll see. So the Liberals are going to have to cooperate with at least one other party. We know that. As minority governments go, though, being only 3 seats short of an overall majority, as minority governments go, the Liberals could have done a lot worse. This is definitely better than what happened to them in 2021. They won 160 seats in 2021. And that put them, I believe it was 10 short of a majority. And you know, they made it work. They made their agreements, but got a little dicey at the end there under Trudeau. But this is definitely a better situation. It's not their ideal, but it's better. So as far as what Canada does next, how they deal with the United States, how they deal with the cost of living issues that are clearly still at the forefront of Canadians' minds, if you want to read into it, how the results in Ontario went. These issues didn't go away, and the Liberals are going to have to deal with these things, and they're giving Mark Carney a chance to deal with some of these things that the Trudeau government was criticized for. But we're just going to have to see what the Liberals do next and how they're going to address these issues, how they're going to try to work with this new parliament, and how they're going to deal with both the domestic and the international issues that are clearly putting a lot of pressure on the Canadian electorate. That new parliament will be sworn in soon, and we'll be watching it. And hopefully you'll be with us in Election Yard too. Follow us on Blue Sky, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and visit electionyard.com.